welcome to our November lecture. My name is Rob Muscat, I'm the President of the Military History Society, and we welcome all our members and non-members, visitors, and it's lovely to have everyone here, although the weather's not as pleasant, but it's great to have you here, so I really appreciate it. So this morning's lecture, as you can see on the screen, is on the guerrilla battle of Tanganyika. So I did a lot of practice on that one. And it's a campaign during World War I. This morning, presenting that, we have Lieutenant Colonel retired Rod Cooke. Rod has extensive experience and background in leadership, management in the army, business and non-for-profit sector. Rod is active in the community and significant, and is currently on 8 boards, including the Sydney Community Services and Rural Futures. His military experience was gained in 16 years in the regular army, graduating from the Royal Military College and serving in the Armoured Corps, with postings at 2nd Cav Regiment, the 3rd and 4th Cavalry Regiment and the Armoured Centre. Then transferred to Army Reserve and served a further 21 years, including postings at the Lancers, HQ 5th Brigade, HQ 2nd Division, HQ Australian Theatre and HQ JOC. And Rod has a long-term interest in military history, and one of his dreams and hopes, and I think he's probably close to achieving that, is to visit all the places Australian troops had served overseas. Can we put our hands together and welcome Rod?
Well, good morning. It was a longer CV, so I'm not sure we dug that one up from, but anyway, lots of the details. So just to add to that, my more recently in May, a couple of us went and did the Greek and Cretan campaign, which was a lovely way to get to that part of the world. But today I wanted to talk about a campaign that's always fascinated me since I was young. I can remember doing a presentation when I was a cadet at Royal Military College on the commander of this campaign. It's fascinating because it's got so many interesting sidelines and bits and pieces that I just find it a very interesting campaign. From a military significance, it's been recognised or is attributed as one of the greatest guerrilla campaigns in history. And at the end of 1918, the German army was still active and hadn't surrendered, which was quite unique for other theatres. So we'll get on into the Tanganyika guerrilla campaign. The sources I'm using, these are the main sources. The big, thick, heavy one, which is Tip and Run, has got a lot of detail into it. The middle one is a good overview, and the one on the left I've had ever since I was a young lad, so I'm not sure whether you can still get it, but there's a few bits and pieces of information around, and there's also some other books on some sidelines of the campaign mentioned as we move along. So firstly, what I'd like to do today is to have a look a little bit about the German colonial empire and put this into perspective in World War I, talk about the strategic context, look at German-British plans, and then go through some details of the campaign, the German offensive, Allied offensive, the fascinating naval campaign, the German defence and withdrawal, and finally the surrender after the armistice had been announced. So firstly, the Germans set up their colonial empire fairly late. So Britain and France and Holland and Portugal had been kicking around in the 1500s, grabbing bits of land, so the Germans thought they should get a bit too. So what they got into was, got into the South African scramble, and in 1890 there was a commission which decided which country had which bit, and I'll show you in a map in a second. But interestingly, in German, a Dr. Karl Peters was the driving force behind the acquisition of German East Africa. German East Africa, just to put it in perspective, was twice as big as Germany. And that was just one of the pieces of land that they had. So here's Africa pre-war. So we'll be looking mostly around here, German East Africa. But I'll mention a little about German West South Africa, which is now Namibia, and they also had some land up here in Cameroon and Togo land. Of course, the Germans had the affront to grab that bit of land because the British wanted it to join up all their possessions so they could build a Cairo to Cape Town railway. And the Germans got nastily in the way. So firstly, the German colonies, we really, as one of their uses, housed the radio and cable links. So as you're familiar, the Germans actually occupied the northern part of Papua New Guinea in World War I and Rabaul, and the first Australian naval and military expedition went in to capture Rabaul. The Germans also had a fleet in the Pacific based out of Tsingtao in China, which is the reason you get good beer in China, is because the Germans set up the breweries there at the time. And the Allied strategy was to try and capture all these colonies, of course to sink all the German ships and to remove the German fleet presence from the Pacific, because it had two modern heavy cruisers and 4 modern light cruisers. So as I said, Tsingtao and Rabaul were captured quite early in the campaign. So I'll go a little bit into the context of Africa before we get into East Africa. So there was German Southwest Africa, and a Boer revolt supported with the Germans occurred, and the Portuguese and the South Africans decided that they would go and grab it. General Botha and Smuts, who cut their teeth in the Boer War on the wrong side, led the campaign, and they had 67,000 South African and 12,000 Portuguese to try and take on 10,000 Germans. And it took 9 months to get the Germans to surrender. So in German East Africa, there was an interesting situation. There was a governor and there was a military commander. The governor, Dr. Schnee, was committed to avoid armed conflict and to try and keep peace. And he wanted the ports in German East Africa to be open. And he moved his capital inland to avoid the British coming in to shell them. The new military commander was a chap called Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. He was technically equal to the governor, and he believed his mission was to fight, not to surrender, not to declare open ports. So the German war aims were really in von Lettow-Vorbeck's head. I haven't been able to find any information of any directives that came out of Germany to the colonies. So he was aware he didn't have the troops to defeat the British, and look, his numbers were quite small. He saw his duty to tie up as many British troops and ships as he could to prevent them from deploying to the battlefields of Europe. So that was his strategy in all that he did. So he wanted to keep his army intact and posing a threat, and we'll follow on how he did that. He would attack if the risk was low, but he would back away if the risk was too high. And he wanted to antagonise not only the British but the Portuguese and the Belgians who had countries on the edge of German Southwest Africa. So the British war aims were fairly simple. They wanted to capture all the German colonies and deny all the ports in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean to the Germans. To allow the command of the sea, the British wanted to make sure they got rid of all the warships. But as a side issue, of course, the British thought that German East Africa would have been a nice spot to have because it had some agricultural promise, whereas Namibia, if you've been there, there's desert and sand dunes and a bit more desert. And of course Cecil Rhodes with his dreams of the Cape to Cairo Railway. So the topography was very challenging, so very varied terrain. It wasn't just jungle. The coastal strip was lush, tropical and very heavily populated. They had lots of mountains, including Mount Kilimanjaro. They had lake systems to the west and south. They had a central plateau that was quite bare and waterless, and a wide variations in climate, from freezing to absolutely boiling, which was a challenge for all the campaigns involved. So this is a bit of a snapshot of German East Africa as it was. There were, and I'll talk about the railway lines because they came important. So there was a railway line from the coast at Dar el Salaam up here to Cooke on Lake Tanganyika, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. There was also a German railway line from Tanga up here to New Moshi, which was just below Mount Kilimanjaro. The British had about the same time built a railroad from Mombasa up to Nairobi and beyond. And that was, we'll talk about that figures in the campaign a little bit later. So some of the main harbours, Tanga and Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam were really main German harbours, and we'll look at those a bit later. And the Fiji Delta, which we'll talk about a lot more about, and down here. Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda were British. This was Belgian territory all the way down here, and the Portuguese had a bit, that's off the map that we'll look at a little bit later. So some of the campaign challenges: long distances, utter lack of infrastructure, a lack of food, ammunition and supplies, difficult terrain, disease, the good old tsetse fly. The Boers plundered in with a couple of mounted divisions who crumbled very quickly as the tsetse flies killed the majority of the horses, and wild animals. I don't know if you remember when I showed the British Railway, but there was 2 lions that ran havoc amongst the British. There's a movie out on it where these 2 lions were killing all the workers on the British Railway. So wild animals were a serious threat. So look at some of the commanders in the campaign. So firstly, von Lettow-Vorbeck, he was a colonial general. So he probably wouldn't have got a gig on the Western Front because he had experiences in uprisings in Southwest Africa and the Boxer Rebellion. He fought alongside African native troops and admired them, and we'll talk a little bit more about African troops. He studied the tactics of the Boers, which he found some use to, but had contempt for the British military commanders. And as we'll see through the campaign, that was very well-deserved commentary. German forces never got more than 15,000 soldiers, of which 12,000 were native troops and 3,000 were Germans. The backbone of the army were called Askaris, the German natives, and the basic unit was a field company of about 200 men. So it had 3 platoons of 60-odd people, a headquarters signals unit, and each company had about 16 to 20 German officers and NCOs who took a number of the command positions, but the Askaris also took command positions, which was quite unusual for the colonial powers at the time. The war saw an expansion up to 40 field companies, and we'll talk about along the way how they went. So each company had along with it 2 Maxim machine guns and 2 37mm field guns, so they were quite an independent, self-contained manoeuvre group. The SMS Königsberg, which was a German light cruiser that we're going to talk a lot more about, added at one point after it was sunk 10 4-inch guns, which the German local industry managed to whack wheels on, and they became field pieces to support the campaign. And each company, interestingly, had several hundred carriers. And interesting through the war, if an Askari died, one of the carriers would step up to become the Askari, and then new other natives would come into the carrier troops. And these carriers, some of these carriers kept on for 4 years, marching around, stepping up to being an Askari and recruiting from local villages. So at the start of the war, we'll talk about logistics. Only 6 of his companies had modern rifles. Most of the troops had smoking, muzzle loading, and other very early style weapons, and we'll talk about how they got through those. They did have a good medical unit, 63 doctors and support staff, and the advantage the German colonials had, as well as the native troops, they were inured to the disease and inured to life in Africa, so they were used to the terrain, the weather, and better survived the disease. And we'll look a little bit later at the Portuguese who couldn't manage that. There was a minimal industrial base, though it could do some clever things I'll talk about later. And again, limited stocks of rifles, weapons, ammunition stores and food. So what were the Allies doing at the time? The early reliance in this theatre was on Indian and South African troops, because the British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian troops were all being called either into the Middle East or into the Western Front. At the start of the war, the British did have 3 battalions of native troops, but the British culture was they didn't trust them, they didn't think they were any good, and didn't use them. So it took a few years for the British to wake up that their most effective troops were actually the native troops. The Portuguese had 10 native companies, and they sent waves of expeditions of up to 19,000 white men who not only performed badly because they were conscripts, but most of them died from disease. Belgium was in a little bit better shape, had about 15,080 troops who performed well, and all of the sides, and we'll look at the numbers later, had enormous numbers of carriers because horses didn't survive, there were no roads, and the railways were cut and destroyed very early. So how did the course of the war go? So the British campaign, firstly, we'll have a look at, really started in 3 phases. They envisaged a short campaign, one of these will be home on Christmas jobs, where they used troops from India to grab the railways. So they raised 2 expeditionary forces. When this failed, they called for the South Africans under General Smuts, who, while he had a good command history, had an ego to match, and so he thought it would be an easy run over. So he had a large amount of troops, and he thought he could pin Lt-Col down and annihilate him in a battle. But the Boers' use of cavalry was not terribly successful because they annoyingly kept on dying. And in the final stage, the British started using native troops and expanded the King's African Rifles, and they called troops over from Cameroon and Togo land, which they had fought against the German colonies there, and brought them over. But of course, when the British started pumping up their troops, the Germans then had the temerity to go around and invade other countries. The Belgians and the Portuguese wanted to be involved because not only was the Germans a threat, but they saw an opportunity to grab more land, which all colonial powers were tending to do at the time. So the first campaigns we'll look at started in Tanga and up the railway line here to Mount Kilimanjaro. So some of the opening moves, the SMS Königsberg, which was a German light cruiser, had been attached to support German West Africa. The rest of the German Pacific Fleet, of one of which was the Emden, which we know, we'll have a look at the Emden at one point. The Emden was also detached to do independent raiding, and the 2 heavy and the 2 light cruisers from the German East Asian Fleet went down to the bottom of South America for some wins and some losses, so I won't talk more about them. But the Königsberg sailed out of Dar es Salaam to create some trouble. The Uganda Protectorate assaulted the German outposts. The UK Cabinet authorised raising of a couple of Indian expeditionary forces. The Germans occupied Taveta, which was, Taveta was here. So that was in British territory, but a good launching point. If Britain wanted to grab the end of the railway, they had to come through Taveta. And the Germans raided the Belgian facilities in Lake Tanganyika and also Portuguese bases to the south. So there are some great images of the time. So there's a German company, field company on the march. So a couple of horses, but not many. So some of the opening moves. The Germans decided to attack the Portuguese outpost, even though Portugal at the time was neutral. On Lake Victoria, the British armed 4 lake steamers who sunk the 2 German naval ships and therefore gained naval superiority. The Germans raided deeper into Kenya and Uganda. On Lake Nyasa, which was to the south, the British gained naval superiority by firing a single shot at the only German ship, which surrendered. But on Lake Tanganyika, the Germans sank the Belgian ship and gained control. We'll talk a little bit more about that one. But von Leeuwenhoek was forced to reanalyse because while they were successful in raising the ire of the Portuguese, the British and the English, they were very costly and didn't achieve a great result. So what was the British plan? So they decided to do a 2-pronged invasion. There was an Indian Expeditionary Force B of 8,000 troops and 2 brigades that would land at Tanga, which was further north at the base of the Northern Railway. And they would capture the city and advance along the Northern Railway line. Another Indian Expeditionary Force with a brigade of 4,000 troops would advance from the northeast and capture New Moshi, which is the northern end of the railway near Mount Kilimanjaro. The Germans were unsure if Tanga or Dar es Salaam would be the first target. So let me talk through some of those. So here's the Northern Railway, Tanga, goes up to here to New Moshi. So an Indian Expedition Force would come here, another one either land here or land here. The Germans weren't sure which would happen, so they had to cover off both. So IFB got a British general who'd never commanded in battle, and he thought poorly of the native African troops. The Indian troops had been pulled together quite hastily, but in the tender caring fashion the British had for colonial troops, they spent 2 weeks on board in port before they weren't allowed ashore, so they'd sit on this rusting, dilapidated hulk in the tropical heat for 2 weeks, and then took them 2 weeks to sail over to Mombasa. So they had no chance to recuperate, acclimatise, or to train, so the British really setting themselves up here for a good win. So the Battle of Tanga was the first engagement where the British invasion force came in. The harbour was too shallow for ships, so liners had to be used to transport the troops from the ship to the shore. No advanced planning had occurred for this engagement. Fear over possible mines in the harbour led them to use a small muddy beach to land on rather than the main harbour. So the liners set off at 6 p.m. into a reef, of course. Sounds like the Americans going into Korea, but anyway, which forced the troops to wade ashore into deep water. By dawn, they managed to have 2 battalions ashore. So this is Tanga. So this is the main town here. The British beach where they landed first was here, and then they used the second beach up here. So the Germans were unsure if this was a feint, and whether they were really actually going to go for the Southern Railway. And they only had 1 company in Tanga. The nearest German troops were up the railway line at New Moshi, and the train with 7 carriages could just carry 1 company at a time. So the Germans started frantically running the train and pulled the company down to Tanga. And the Germans managed to block the British advance with the 1 company. The German reinforcements, as they arrived, train by train, were thrown into action, and they outflanked the 61st Pioneers, who broke. Then the 2nd Brigade landed at the other beach. Again, no reconnaissance was undertaken, even though they'd been there for a day. But the Germans had withdrawn from town in the face of the land because they recognised they were outnumbered. When later on more troops arrived, and noting that the British hadn't moved, they reoccupied the town. So the British then decided to slowly advance through very difficult terrain, including bumping into some wild bee hives, which were almost as effective as the Germans were. So they advanced with 8 battalions. Several Indian units broke or warped and wouldn't advance any further, and the freshly arrived German companies counterattacked and drove the British back. But one of those puzzling issues, a bugle call from the Germans sounding retreat suddenly popped up, so all the troops retreated in accordance with the bugle, but they weren't sure why. So the British had pulled back to their ships. That is the latest part of the campaign with the Germans flanking the British forces. So with the British having withdrawn, the campaign or the battle ended with the Germans, who only had 1,000 soldiers, defeated 9,000 British troops. The Germans lost 71 killed and 76 wounded, and inflicted 360 dead, 467 wounded, and 148 men missing. Left behind, which was nice of the British, 16 machine guns, a bunch of rifles, lots of ammunition, clothing, telephone equipment, coats and blankets. So the Germans were able to equip 3 of their companies with modern weapons, which was very nice of the British. So Tanga was a failure, but in the north, the Indians had advanced again, and now took limited operations and occupied a town called Jasin. Von Lettow-Vorbeck thought there was a chance to bloody the British nose again, so he gathered 9 companies and attacked Jasin. Unfortunately, the element of surprise were lost. They had a German Arab company who were only mentioned here, and they never got mentioned again, so I suspect they were put up against a wall or they deserted. A German Arab company, noting that Dar es Salaam was an Arab, so they had a lot of Arab citizens, I guess you can call them, and they had a company of them. So they fired and fled, and they found a fort the British had set up, and so the fort was waiting for reinforcements but surrendered, but the cost was quite excessive in terms of casualties and ammunition expenditure. So we're going to move slightly into the nautical theme a little bit. Everyone's seen the film African Queen? What did it do at the end of the movie? Tried to sink a German cruiser.
Sank a German boat.
Sank a German boat. And the book by Will Smith, Shadow of the Devil, and the film with Roger Moore in it. What did he do at the end of it? Tried to sink a German cruiser. So let's talk about that German cruiser. The SMS Königsberg, which we mentioned earlier. A fairly modern German light cruiser with 10 4-inch guns. At the start of the war, when it left Dar es Salaam, after the port has been declared open, it sank a merchant ship and managed to capture an old British cruiser, the HMS Pegasus, in Zanzibar Harbour, and sank it as well. So Churchill got a bit miffed and deployed 3 cruisers, albeit older cruisers, but with bigger guns, to sink the Königsberg. So the Königsberg had some problems with its boilers, it was running out of coal, so it decided to slink up the Rufiji River Delta, all waiting for repairs and coal supplies. So here's just some photos. They set up some defences along the riverbank to stop the British following up. There is the Königsberg in the Rufiji Delta before the British found it, and there it is after the British found it. And the main cause was they had 2 of these, which were a ship called a Monitor. So it had 2 big heavy guns at the front and a turret, 2 big heavy guns at the back and a turret. And these originally were for Brazil, but in the best British fashion, if they had foreign countries who paid for their ships in the ports, like those 2 German Turkish cruisers, the British just grabbed them. So they grabbed these 2, which was quite useful for them. So here's the Rufiji River. So you can see a number of deltas, and so there's a lot of manoeuvring where the Königsberg moved around to keep the British on their toes. The British set up on an island off here called Guerillas Island, where they used a plane to do some spotting, which was one of the first use of aircraft in ground and naval battles. And when they pinned down the last location, which was here, the 2 monitors came forward, stayed out of initially came inside the Königsberg's range, and there's an exchange of fire, which the monitors got the worst of. So they pulled back a little bit because they were out of range and shelled the shit out of the poor SMS Königsberg. But so I guess talking about some of the ingenuity while they were in there, as I mentioned earlier, the Königsberg had some problems with its coal supply and with some of the burners. So they got they took some of the equipment off the ship, wheeled it over to Dar es Salaam, repaired it, wheeled it all back, put it back in the ship, and the ship was good to go again. But unfortunately she got blocked in. But the crew and the guns all went ashore, and suddenly became part of Lt-Col army, and we'll mention them as we move on. As a side issue, when I was poking around here, I'd been asked a question about naval, and I did a bit more research and found, of course, there was an Australian ship that was intimately involved with this campaign. And everyone knows about the HMAS Pioneer. Okay, there it is. So now this could have been on the tips of everybody's lips. So it was commissioned by the Royal Navy in 1900. It was an older style cruiser, a 3rd class protected cruiser. It transferred to the Royal Australian Navy in 1912. It was a training ship in 1914, and patrolled the West Australian coast in the outbreak of war and captured a couple of German ships. But what was interesting for me, for those who want to have a bit of a what if, it was the escort cruiser for the first AIF to sail to the Middle East. But it had engine trouble, so they swapped her out for the HMAS Sydney. So I'm not sure the 3rd-rate old British second-hand cruiser would have done much of a job against the SMS Emden, but it's one of those who knows. So she was assigned to German East Africa when she got her engines fixed and helped bottle up the Königsberg and patrol the blockade runners. She bombarded Dar es Salaam and was paid off in November 1916. But despite only 2 years and being obsolete and decrepit, she probably saw more combat than all the other Australian ships in World War I. So I'll throw that one out as a challenge for the HMAS Pioneer. So while this was happening down the Rufiji Delta, there was a railway war happening. So the Battle of Tanganyika and Jasin showed the Germans that they really couldn't sustain large-scale frontal assaults, which is too damage, not in casualties, but also in ammunition. They couldn't afford to lose them. The British had spent 5 years building their railway from Mombasa to the interior, 700 kilometres, and so it was quite open to the Germans and quite gaily. So it was like the American Civil War again, cutting railways and destroying bridges and burning, turning the rails and destroying rolling stock. On all the other borders, the Germans patrolled actively to capture rifles, ammunition and horses where they could get them. And enough horses were captured for the Germans to mount a second company, which assisted in their mobility. So as I said, there was no industry here. Everything had to be brought in or captured. So the Germans sent through a few blockade runners, which, as I understand it, sort of pretended to be Danish ships and ducked out of Hamburg harbour and negotiated across the North Sea and manoeuvred around to try and get to German East Africa. One of the blockade runners, the Rubens, made it to just north of Tanga and was run aground when it was chased. But the British thought running it aground was enough, so they sailed off. So the Germans came and emptied the half-sunken ship, and because the ammunition had been dampened, they couldn't waste a good bullet, so they opened them up, dried out the powder, put it back in, and they had a 20% failure rate on the ammunition. So they used this for training and kept their bit of ammunition. So it was just some of the interesting ingenuity that the German forces in East Africa were using. A little bit more naval warfare. Again, I find this fascinating. The Germans decided to build a ship specifically to go to Lake Tanganyika. So the ship Götzen was built in Germany. It was broken up into 5,000 railway-sized crates, or narrow-gauge railway-sized crates, shipped to Dar es Salaam, and then motored up the railway line to Lake Tanganyika, where she was reassembled. They popped on a gun from the Königsberg, and she went off to take control of the lake. But the British, and sometimes the British do some clever things, even though I think in the campaign they weren't terribly clever, but in the best boy's own manual, someone had an idea: let's send 2 torpedo boats to sink the German cruiser on the lake and get command of the lake. So they did. So these 2 40-foot torpedo boats, the Mimi and the Tutu, will sail all the way from England down to Cape Town. Train, down across country, bit of river, and here we are up there. This is how they got there. They had a steam tractor towing the boat, and they built bridges and roads through the impenetrable jungle to get there. Absolutely fascinating. So, with the Germans not knowing anything about it, they suddenly had 2 40-foot boats on the lake, who captured 2 German smaller ships, and the Germans decided this was too much for them, so they scuttled the Götzen. But not to be outdone, the Götzen was raised and is still being used today as a ferry on Lake Tanganyika. So if you go to Lake Tanganyika, don't catch the ferry. So back to land operations. So at this point, the Indians had been a failure, so the South Africans were asked to step in and provide the troops. So massive South African reinforcement on the way. By the end of 1915, 75% of the Indians were forced to combat through disease or death. But new Indian forces were coming and new commanders on the way. So General Tighe wanted to use these new troops before they got too crook and too disease-ridden. So we had to go at attacking Salita Hill, which was guarded the German approach to Tavita, which is quite early, where are we? Tavita's here at the north end of the railway. So the Battle of Salita Hill, 6,000 British troops with all those weaponry, 2 armoured cars, which is a difference for this campaign, and spotter aircraft, took on about 1,000 Germans. So the spotter planes were used to guide heavy artillery onto the German lines, but when the British assaulted in, they discovered they were dummy positions, and like time spent in reconnaissance, it was clearly wasted, and they took heavy fire. So 2 assaults were repulsed, and the British withdrew from this battle. So General Smuts decided he wanted to take the advantage, dashing Boer commander as he was, and he openly stated he wanted to use the Zulu tactics, because the Germans wouldn't have heard of that. So he had a central column to pin von Lettow-Vorbeck in place, and he put 2 flanking columns out to surround him and destroy him in place. So Smuts had 31,000 troops, the Belgians had about 12,500, and there were 15,000 Germans in the battle at this point. So these are some of the campaigns. So the British men would have grabbed, and we'll talk about grabbing into the railway, marched down the railway. They sent a flanking column here, which we'll talk about, and then other troops came down here along the railway from the south, and some very vain efforts here from the British to try and come up from the south. So the German defences held the British advance. and the flanking column went forward. But the rainy season had started, so not terribly good timing on behalf of the British. The British mounted column was having great difficulties, especially when 3/4 of the horses died along the way. And so they got to their point eventually, where they were supposed to get to, but they only had 3,000 men fit for duty out of the 10,000 that started. So von Leto saw an opportunity to wipe out this flanking column, so he massed his forces when the rain stopped. A naval siege followed, or an artillery siege followed, where the Königsberg gun was exchanging fire with the British guns that were salvaged from the sunken HMS Pegasus. So we had two lots of Navy dudes firing guns at each other. The column entrenched and consolidated their position, but the British were pushing down the railway line, and von Leto gave up his plan to attack the force. And at this time, the last blockade runner war material arrived, because the Germans were starting to lose their ports, so it was difficult to get things in. So for the Germans to concentrate, it had to pull troops from other areas, and that meant the Belgians managed to push through Rwanda and Burundi. The Portuguese made an effort, but most of the white troops that had been shipped in as conscripts died from disease or were incapacitated by disease. But Smuts managed to march down towards Tanganyika with 3 columns of 7,500 men. The Germans withdrew to a plateau further south. So we get to 1917, so here we are, 14, 15, 16, 17, and the British are flailing around getting their backside kicked. So the Germans were down to 9,000 troops, of which 1,500 were European. Smuts then tried to surround von Leto with landings on the coast, and a German counterattack at Kavati started, but again ran into heavy opposition and had to pull back. But interestingly, amongst the defending troops were native West African troops, so the British had woken up to themselves and started shipping native troops in to fight. So General Smuts, who really stuffed up the campaign, but was given an out. He was going to be South Africa's representative at the Imperial War Conference in London, so he could gaily go off and say, well, I've won this campaign, there's nothing more to do, I'll just go off and sip champagne in London. So he declared the campaign effectively over in 1917 and we moved on. Of course, the new commander knew it wasn't over and wanted more troops. So he called for greater troops. One of the Germans' subordinates, Captain Wintkins, decided he was a bit bored with this falling back and not doing anything, so he decided to launch a raid back into German East Africa. It lasted for 8 months until he was finally surrounded when they were out of ammunition. So this is this Wintkins' character decided to head off, dumpty, until he was cornered at the Leda Hill with no ammunition and surrendered. But the Germans had been falling further south, and the British had followed up, and the British had done some landings in these ports, which we spoke about. That's where the German East African troops had first started. And this border here is Portugal, which will become important very shortly. So the British advanced in 3 columns, pushed the Germans off the plateau, blocked the ports as I mentioned. At Lindi, the Germans were slowing the British advance down, so they sent the Nigerian brigade in of native troops, and the German counterattack forced the Nigerians into a defensive position and nearly destroyed them all. But the Lindi Force commander pushed troops to break through to the Nigerians to help them out, and the Germans reinforced, but realised they couldn't take them on, they couldn't destroy the Nigerian brigade. So the Germans withdrew, but of the 4,500 British troops, 1,500 were casualties, and of the Germans they lost, of the 1,500 they lost 500 casualties. But the main problem was the Germans shot off a lot of their ammunition, 850,000 rounds. So von Leto-Vorbeck, realising time for change of strategy, he couldn't fight them directly. Just as a side, this is a painting that was done at the time. There was a South African unit which started this battle with 150 troops, and they were put into harm's way, advanced across an open field, not realising German machine guns were on their flank, and came out of it with 50 men. So it was 25th Royal Fusiliers. So we're moving to the final stage of the campaign. So in November 1917, von Leto decided he couldn't maintain his army. He just had too many troops for the supplies and logistics available. So he decided he wanted to cut his army to the bone. So he put everyone through a medical exam. So the 7,700 men were deemed unfit for service, including 700 Europeans. Interestingly, the governor, who had been following the campaign with the headquarters of Lt-Col, made the cut, as did the commander of the SMS Königsberg, who was fighting along with a number of his naval personnel. So on the 25th November, von Leto crossed into Portuguese territory, and a separate column which was to join him couldn't locate him and had surrendered. Again, one of those fascinating sideshows. The Germans couldn't get blockade runners through the British blockade, so they decided to send a Zeppelin. Makes sense. So they used a Zeppelin L-59, which was leaving in November 1917, carried ammunition, spare parts, machine guns, and it was a one-way trip. They recognised the airship wouldn't make it back, so it was designed that it could be cannibalised on landing and using materials for tents or clothes or whatever they wanted to do with the materials. But unfortunately, the landing site was in British hands. And now there's a couple of stories about this. One is that the British intelligence had discovered this and had sent false radio messages to the Zeppelin to say that, oh, there's nowhere you can land, or that the Germans came to that conclusion themselves, because the German column was pretty hard to find, so they headed off into Portugal at the time. So the flight was aborted after travelling for 4 days in the air, 6,800 kilometres to get almost to Germany, East Africa, and then went back to Germany again. So we came to the final stage of the campaign. So the Germans decided they want to get to Ngoma, I think mainly for supplies, which had a garrison of 1,200 men. Savage fighting got them 6 machine guns and 250,000 rounds of ammo. The British knew they couldn't rely on the Portuguese to hold the Germans, so British troops went into Portugal to chase the Germans down. But the British columns were always slower than the German columns. So we had a bit of a chase through Portuguese Africa. So they crossed into Portugal here, all the way down, back again, and then decided, well, let's go and invade Northern Rhodesia. So in the final stage, the Portuguese troops would run on hearing the German approach. So they'd leave their machine guns and ammunition and bolt. And the Germans had more supplies than they could carry. So because von Leto was losing troops to disease and desertion, he decided to head back out of the jungle to better pastures. So for the final stage, von Leto crossed back into Germany, East Africa. He had total freedom because the British just could not catch up with him. So he decided to invade Northern Rhodesia and attack a town called Fife. But with no artillery, he couldn't overcome the garrison. On the 12th of November, he captured a dispatch rider who informed him that war in Europe was over. So he got up to, he tried to get to Fife, but couldn't make it, and was stopped up here at Abercorn. So with no reason to continue, von Leto halted his column. A column of the King's African Rifles caught up with him, who had to admit they were just about to give up, and did they have any spare food that the British could use. So on the 25th November, von Leto surrendered at Abercorn, and their force consisted of 155 Europeans, including the governor, 1,156 Askaris and 1,500 porters. All of his weapons, all of the rifles were captured, British, Portuguese, or other, and all but 6 of the machine guns were captured. So he was certainly living off the land. And he left for Germany in 17 January 1919. So what was the aftermath of this campaign? Germany, East Africa, of course, was annexed by the British. Belgium got Burundi and Rwanda. Portugal got a piece of land called the Kiongi Triangle, and the Germans were repatriated back to Germany. In March 1919, a welcome probe was held for von Leto in Berlin, and he was trotted around the country to sell war bonds to help Germany recover. And as an interesting note, he was mooted by Winston Churchill as a possible leader of Germany post-World War II. He was that well regarded. So let's look at some of the casualties. So the British lost 11,000 killed, interesting, 95,000 porters. Belgium, 2,600 dead and about 15,000 porters. Portugal, they don't have porter numbers, but 5,000 killed and 5,000 missing in PW. About 37,000 casualties from the Allied forces. The Germans had about 16,000 casualties, 2,000 killed, 2,800 deserted, 7,000 porters died. But the civilian cost is even more frightening. So they believe that 365,000 civilians died in this campaign, of the bulk of which were Belgium, and the Germans were pretty close as well. A death rate of 1 in 7 people of the native population. By 1917, they had 1 million porters in use. Of the 45,000 Kenyan porters that they died, it was 13% of the male population. And 20% of the East African carrier corps died over the German carriers. So massive impact on the civilians. So guerrilla warfare. So the Germans had to live off the land. They used captured equipment, ammunition, stores, wherever they could get it, and they used raids and attack to keep the enemy on their back foot. They certainly outfought and outgeneraled the Allied troops, and there was a number of commanders who cycled through, all to no avail. And the Germans took the initiative and were unpredictable. So in summary, the East African campaign were the only Germans not beaten in World War I. They fought a successful 4-year guerrilla campaign, diverted 400,000 troops, sailors and support personnel, assisted by 600,000 African bearers. Over 200,000 Indian South African troops were employed in German East Africa, and there were some minor naval and merchant ship diversions to sink the Königsberg and support the campaign. And it met von Lettow-Vorbeck's aim was to divert troops and resources from Europe. And a number of historians have stated perhaps it's the greatest guerrilla campaign in history. Are there any questions?
We have got time for questions. Yes.
Your figure of 135,000 Germans who died during the war, I assume that's primarily...
They were porters.
Well, yeah, so Africans, not Europeans.
Yeah.
Because I think there are only about 15,000 German settlers in Tanganyika.
Yeah, so there was 2,000 Germans killed.
Yeah.
And 2,800.
But your next slide, yeah, 135 German, I think that's primarily natives.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, that I meant German native support, German native civilians rather than British or Portuguese native civilians.
And would you tell everyone what Lettow-Vorbeck's response to Hitler was?
No.
Well, it was a bit more pithy. Hitler, when he became Chancellor, directly tried to approach a whole lot of German World War I generals to get their support for his regime, and some of them said yes. He personally approached von Lettow-Vorbeck and he said, F off. But that gives the indication of the sort of man he was.
Yes.
I'm curious how both Germans and the British were able to employ native population into the war effort, and whether or not it was done willingly or voluntarily or otherwise.
So, two parts of the answer. The Askaris, or the native troops, were recruited and paid. Not much, but they voluntarily came into uniform. The carriers were impressed. But as you saw, as I mentioned with the Germans, if an Askari was killed, one of the native porters would step up and pick up his gun and his uniform and fill the gap. So while they were impressed, or conscripted, however you like to call it, and they probably shot if they tried to desert, but they had enough that they would go in, and enough of them would volunteer to go step into uniform. So most of the native porters weren't there willingly.
Weren't they willingly?
Weren't there willingly.
Thank you.
That wasn't the case for the European and South African carriers, was it? None of them moved up.
I think as well, I'm not sure they were paid a good wage, and I'm not sure they had too much of a choice. And especially during the campaign, if you had a few reporters die and there was a village on the side of the road that you were walking past, come aboard. So, yeah, so I think they were all.
None of them stepped up, so they...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of the native porters weren't there willingly. Weren't there willingly.
That wasn't the case for the European and South African carriers, was it?
Weren't there willingly.
None of them moved up.
Weren't there willingly.
and I think somewhere from the King's African Rifles or one of the native troops died, no order to step up in their place.
I'm unsure of that one. I know for the Germans, I haven't seen any commentary to that state for the other Allied forces.
You mentioned pay. How did the Germans pay the people?
Look, a good question. I know after the war, the Germans went back to give medals out, and the interesting story of how they decided who of the natives that turned up for the medal ceremony, they got them to do their basic arms drill. If you could shoulder arms properly, you got the medal. But pay, I'm not sure how they did the pay, because they didn't have much. I wouldn't have thought they carried cash around with them that much. So I'm not sure how they went through the pay issue. Yes.
Is there any analysis of the death rate, what percentage is caused by disease and what was in active farming?
I haven't seen it. It's probably there, but
I've just, from what I've read, it's as high as like 75-80% is died from disease more than anything else.
yes, yeah, it was a high figure, but I don't know the exact number. Yes.
I'm just interested to know what happened to those 7,000 guys who didn't make the medical cut. Did they just...
They surrendered.
Oh, it's okay.
So they waited for the British to catch up and surrendered. And as I said, the interesting part was the governor was there at the end. He was with the final column that surrendered.
Okay, any other,
This is more of a question. The tsetse flies, were they fundamentally affecting the horses or all livestock?
I don't know the answer to that. Any livestock
I
into the room?
think they just go for a couple of horses with sets of lamb. Yeah, they don't, with the wild animals, so would it be, and maybe not the couple that live there. Very near.
So yeah, so there were horses that were immune to it because the Germans had two mounted companies.
Oh, okay.
So it killed a percentage of horses. Other horses were immune
Yeah.
and then could be used. And I believe you can salt them. What the technical term is.
But those from South Africa, for example, had no immunity.
But it seems to be they had no immunity from South Africa, which I thought they would have after the war campaign.
They could have recruited zebras.
okay.
Was there any evidence of a British review of the campaign? Was it ever assessed and people held accountable, or?
They were the winners, the victors never.
Lessons learned.
I'm not aware of it.
There were a number of staff college examinations and analysis of it, and the results were very critical. But they didn't can any post-general.
But it wasn't an official government review of performance or anything. So, you know, Smuts got out of there and went on to greater things. So who knows where to go?
So they really make sense in the Australian rivals.
I think our horses would have gone down the Setsy fight anyway.
Right, there's no more questions. Put a hands together. Thank you, Roger.